The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight. But 17-year-old Axel Berglund sat comfortably in his underground shelter, tending a fire no larger than a cooking flame. Above ground, less than half a mile away, men twice his age were burning their furniture and still freezing to death in their proud log cabins. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1887, and winter was supposed to be over. Axel Berglund stood beside his father Gunnar at the doorway of their log cabin in the Montana Territory, watching dark clouds gather over the northern peaks. It was March 14th, and the wildflowers had already started pushing through the melting snow along the creek banks. Spring was here, or so everyone thought. Gunnar was 42 years old, a mining engineer who had left the copper mines of Minnesota 5 years earlier to try his hand at trapping. He had taught Axel everything he knew about working underground, about reading rock formations and understanding how the earth held temperature differently than the air above it. Those lessons had seemed abstract to Axel, interesting but not particularly useful in a trapper's life. That was about to change. The storm hit 2 hours after sunset. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. Wind screamed down from the mountains with a force that made their cabin walls shudder. Gunnar immediately started building up the fire in their stone hearth, feeding it split pine until flames roared up the chimney. Axel stuffed rags into the gaps around the door and covered the single window with a spare bearskin. Their cabin was typical of the era and the region. 14 feet by 16 feet, built from lodgepole pine logs, notched at the corners. The chinking between logs was a mixture of mud and moss that Gunnar had applied the previous summer. It worked adequately in normal conditions, but normal had just ended. The walls were single log thick, and while that stopped the wind, it did almost nothing to hold heat. The dirt floor was frozen solid. The roof was pole and bark construction covered with a layer of sod. By midnight, despite the massive fire consuming their carefully stacked firewood at an alarming rate, Axel could see his breath inside the cabin. He wore every piece of clothing he owned. Gunnar had wrapped himself in 2 wool blankets and their remaining furs. They took turns feeding the fire through the night, knowing that if it died, they would die with it. Gunnar talked to keep himself alert. He told Axel about working in the Minnesota mines, how the shafts stayed at 55 degrees year-round, regardless of surface temperature. In summer, miners would descend into cool relief. In winter, the same shafts felt warm compared to the frozen world above. The earth held its temperature, Gunnar explained, insulated by the mass of soil and rock. 100 feet down, the seasons barely existed. Axel listened, feeding split logs into flames that seemed to provide less warmth with each passing hour. He noticed his father's sentences growing shorter, his words coming slower. The cold was winning despite everything they were doing to fight it. Morning came gray and brutal. The storm had not diminished. Gunnar's hands were shaking as he added more wood to the fire. They had burned through half their winter supply in a single night, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Axel watched his father move slowly, methodically, like a man moving through deep water. The cold was inside both of them now, settling into their bones despite the layers of wool and fur. The cabin temperature hovered somewhere near freezing. Ice had formed on the inside of the walls where their breath condensed and froze against the logs. Every gap in the chinking had become visible as thin lines of frost. The bearskin over the window was stiff and rigid. When Axel touched the door, the wood felt like stone. Gunnar sat heavily on the split log bench near the fire. His breathing seemed labored. He pulled the blankets tighter and stared into the flames. Axel added more wood, trying to calculate how many hours of fuel remained. At this rate of consumption, they would run out before the storm ended. Then the calculations would not matter. His father started talking again, but his voice was different now, quieter, more distant. He spoke about the mine shafts again, about how the Norwegian miners in Minnesota had built their homes partially underground in the old country. Earth-sheltered, they called them. Homes that used the ground itself as insulation. Gunnar had seen sketches once, architectural drawings of houses built into hillsides with thick earth roofs. The principle was simple, he explained. Air temperature changed rapidly. Earth temperature changed slowly. At a depth of just 6 feet, the ground maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. Build your home into that stable environment instead of exposing it to every shift in the weather, and you would need far less fuel to stay warm, or cool in summer. Axel asked why they had not built their cabin that way. Gunnar smiled, a tired expression. Because everyone builds log cabins above ground. Because that is what trappers do, what mountain men do. Because digging into frozen ground is hard work, and cutting logs is easier. Because tradition is powerful, even when it kills you. Through the second night, Axel kept the fire burning. He dozed sitting up, jerking awake every time the flames diminished. Each time he woke, he added wood and checked on his father. Gunnar slept fitfully, his breathing shallow and irregular. The storm continued its assault on their inadequate shelter. Dawn came again, weak light filtering through cracks around the bearskin. The wind had finally dropped. The temperature outside was still brutal, but the worst had passed. Axel stood stiffly, his joints aching from cold and tension. He moved to wake his father. Gunnar did not wake. Sometime during the night, while Axel had fought to keep the fire alive, his father had simply stopped fighting the cold. He looked peaceful, wrapped in his blankets near the fire that had not been enough to save him. Axel was 17 years old and completely alone. The ground was still frozen, but Axel broke it anyway. He chose a hillside overlooking the creek where his father had set his trap lines for 5 winters. It took him 4 hours to dig through frost-hardened soil with a pickaxe and shovel. His hands blistered and bled. He did not stop. He wrapped Gunnar in the wool blankets and lowered him into the earth. He spoke no words over the grave. His father had not been a religious man, and Axel had no prayers memorized. He simply filled the hole, packed the soil tight, and marked the site with stones he carried from the creek bed. When it was finished, he sat beside the grave until sunset. The community expected him to leave. Einar, their nearest neighbor 8 miles south, rode up 3 days after the storm to check on them. He found Axel alone, processing the beaver pelts his father had trapped before the storm. Einar was a thick-shouldered Norwegian in his 50s who had survived 12 winters in the territory. The boy should come to town, Einar said, find work, live with civilized folk. A 17-year-old had no business trying to work a trapline alone. The mountains killed experienced men regularly. They would kill a boy even faster. It was the practical thing to do, the sensible thing. Axel thanked him for the concern and said he would stay. Einar argued. Axel continued working the pelts. Eventually Einar left, shaking his head at the stubbornness of youth and grief. Over the next week, Axel examined the cabin that had killed his father. He studied it with the methodical attention Gunnar had taught him to apply to engineering problems. The structure was fundamentally flawed, not because it was poorly built, but because its entire design philosophy was wrong. The cabin fought the environment. It stood exposed to wind from every direction. Its thin walls allowed heat to escape as fast as the fire could generate it. The gaps between logs, no matter how well chinked, created pathways for cold air to infiltrate. The roof provided minimal insulation. The dirt floor transmitted cold directly upward from the frozen ground. In moderate weather, these flaws were manageable. In extreme cold, they became fatal. His father had died with a roaring fire less than 6 feet away because the cabin could not hold the heat being produced. The structure had failed its most basic purpose. Axel sat on the hillside near his father's grave and thought about the mine shafts. about constant temperature regardless of season, about Earth as insulation rather than foundation, about building with the environment instead of against it. Most men would have accepted that cabins were simply inadequate in extreme cold and moved on. Axel became obsessed with solving the problem, not for profit or recognition, but because his father had died in a preventable way, and the solution was buried in the lessons Gunnar had taught him. He began planning something no trapper in the territory had attempted. Axel started paying attention to things other men ignored. He watched where animals denned for winter. Badgers dug deep burrows that remained snow-free even during storms. Bear caves extended back into hillsides, protected by earth on 3 sides. Ground squirrels disappeared into tunnel systems that somehow stayed dry despite spring runoff. He rode to an abandoned copper mine 15 miles east, a small operation that had closed 3 years earlier when the vein played out. The entrance tunnel extended 60 feet into the hillside. Axel walked into darkness, lighting his way with a pine torch. The temperature difference was immediate and obvious. Outside, the April air was cold enough to see breath. 20 feet into the tunnel, that chill disappeared. 40 feet in, the air felt almost warm. Axel placed his hand against the rock wall. It was not hot, but it was not cold either. It was simply stable, holding a temperature that had nothing to do with the frozen world outside. He spent an hour in that tunnel thinking. The mine had no fire, no heating system, no insulation as trappers understood it, just earth and rock creating a buffer against temperature extremes. The principle his father had described was not theory, it was physics, demonstrated in stone. Over the next 2 weeks, Axel visited every trapper camp within 20 miles. He claimed to be checking trap lines and trading pelts, but his real purpose was studying cabin construction and failure. He found abundant evidence of both. He saw cabins with doors torn from hinges by bears. He found structures abandoned after corners rotted and walls shifted. He examined chimneys that drafted poorly and filled interiors with smoke. He noted cabins built in low areas that flooded every spring. Each failure taught him something. He also talked to the men who had survived the March storm. Their stories were consistent. They had burned enormous amounts of firewood. They had sealed every gap they could find. They had worn every piece of clothing they owned. And they had still nearly frozen. One trapper, a Swede named Bjorn, who worked the Yellowstone tributaries, described huddling with his 2 partners around a fire so large it scorched the cabin walls. Despite the flames, ice had formed on their water bucket 6 feet from the hearth. They had survived by luck and youth, nothing more. Axel asked Bjorn what he would do differently if another storm came. Bjorn shrugged. Build the fire earlier, stock more wood, hope for better luck. The idea that cabin design itself could change never entered the conversation. That pattern repeated everywhere. Men accepted that extreme cold meant extreme danger. They stockpiled firewood and prayed for mild winters. None of them questioned whether the fundamental approach to shelter was flawed. Axel returned home with pages of notes and sketches. Axel selected his building site with the precision his father had used to assess mineral deposits. He walked the area around their old cabin for 3 days, studying drainage patterns, soil composition, and sight lines. The location he finally chose was unusual enough that when Einar rode past and saw him surveying, the older man stopped to investigate. The site was on a gentle rise 50 yards from the creek, elevated enough to avoid spring flooding, but not so high that hauling water would be burdensome. More importantly, the rise provided natural drainage in all directions and clear visibility of approaching threats, whether animal or human. The soil was rocky but stable, not the easiest to dig but far better than clay that would hold water. Einar watched Axel drive stakes into the ground, marking a rectangle 14 feet by 18 feet. He asked what the boy was planning. Axel explained he was building a new cabin. Einar nodded approval until Axel mentioned it would be underground. The older Norwegian stared at him. Underground, like a root cellar. Axel shook his head. Like a home, he said, built into the earth for insulation, using the ground's constant temperature to reduce fuel needs. Einar's expression shifted from confusion to concern. That was not how men built cabins. That was not how anyone built anything meant for living. A man needed to see the horizon, needed walls above ground, needed a proper structure. What Axel described sounded like a grave or an animal burrow. It was unnatural. It was wrong. Axel listened politely and continued marking his site. Einar tried a different approach. The ground was still partially frozen. Digging would be brutal work, for a cabin that would likely flood with the first heavy rain, or collapse under its own weight, or suffocate anyone inside from lack of air. The idea was foolish, born of grief and inexperience. When Axel did not respond, Einar shook his head and rode off. The boy would learn, he muttered. Hard work and failure taught better than words. Axel began digging the next morning. He started with a pickaxe, breaking through the frost-hardened surface layer. The first 2 feet of soil came up in chunks of frozen earth. His shoulders ached after an hour. His hands, barely healed from digging his father's grave, blistered again. He worked from dawn until dark, removing soil 1 pickaxe strike at a time. He was excavating a pit 4 feet deep across the entire footprint of his planned structure. The removed earth he piled carefully to the north side, planning to use it later for the roof berm. After 3 days, he had managed to excavate only the first 18 inches across half the area. At this rate, the digging alone would take months. Axel did not care. He had no trap lines to run, no pressing business elsewhere. He had only this task and the memory of his father dying 6 feet from a roaring fire. He kept digging. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. The Berglund boy had lost his mind with grief. He was digging his own grave. He would work himself to death on a fool's project and prove that 17 was too young to survive alone. Axel heard the rumors and ignored them. The digging consumed 6 weeks of brutal labor. Axel worked 16-hour days, breaking only to eat and sleep. The pickaxe became an extension of his arms. The shovel moved earth in a rhythm that continued in his dreams. His hands developed thick calluses. His shoulders broadened from the constant lifting. His body adapted to the work because it had no choice. The soil fought him at every depth. The first 2 feet were frost-hardened and rocky. The next foot was dense clay mixed with stones. Below that, he hit a layer of gravel and larger rocks that required careful removal. Each rock had to be pried loose, lifted out, and added to the growing pile he was accumulating for wall construction. He discovered the importance of drainage immediately. After a spring rain, water pooled in the bottom of his excavation. If he built directly on that surface, his underground cabin would flood with every storm. The solution required additional work. He dug a French drain along the uphill side of the pit, a gravel-filled trench that would intercept groundwater before it reached his structure. Inside the main excavation, he created a drainage system using the rocks he had removed. He laid a 6-inch base layer of fist-sized stones across the entire floor, creating a permeable foundation that would allow any water that did enter to drain away rather than pool. Over this, he added smaller gravel, then a layer of coarse sand. The result was a floor that would never hold standing water. Einar returned in early May to find Axel standing waist-deep in a pit, moving rocks. The older man sat on his horse and watched in silence for several minutes. Finally, he called down, asking if Axel had hit bedrock or was simply trying to dig to China. Axel explained the drainage system, the layered floor, the water management principles his father had taught him from mine construction. Einar listened with the expression of a man watching someone speak gibberish. When Axel finished, Einar offered simple advice. Fill in the hole, build a proper cabin, and stop wasting time. Other trappers were less kind in their assessment. Bjorn, the Swede who had nearly frozen in March, stopped by to deliver a beaver pelt he owed Gunnar. He found Axel constructing a gravel sump at the low corner of the excavation. Bjorn laughed openly. The boy was building a burrow like a frightened animal. A man stood tall in the wilderness. A man built a cabin that could be seen, that announced his presence. Living underground was what you did when you gave up being a man. Axel thanked him for the pelt and returned to work. The mockery did not anger him. These men had survived by accepting the way things were done. They would never understand attempting something different until circumstances forced them to pay attention. By mid-May, the excavation was complete, 4 feet deep across the entire footprint with proper drainage, a stable floor system, and earth berms on 3 sides, where he had piled the excavated soil. He had removed approximately 40 tons of earth and rock by hand. He was ready to start building. Axel spent the first week of June gathering stones. He worked the creek beds within 3 miles of his site, selecting rocks based on size and shape. He wanted stones that were relatively flat on at least 2 sides, rocks that would stack with minimal gaps. Each stone had to be carried or dragged back to his building site. It was slow, methodical work that added muscle to his frame. He rejected rounded river rocks in favor of angular fieldstone. He passed over soft sandstone that would crumble under pressure. He selected granite, limestone, and dense sedimentary rocks that would support weight without degrading. By the end of the week, he had accumulated several tons of building material sorted by size into rough piles. The mortar recipe came from his father's notes about mine shaft construction. Axel mixed clay from the creek bank with sand, horsehair he had collected from his father's old saddle, and traded materials and chopped straw. The horsehair and straw acted as reinforcement, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. The ratio mattered. Too much clay, and the mortar would shrink and crack. Too much sand, and it would not bind properly. He tested batches, creating small sections of wall and observing how they cured. He adjusted the mixture until he achieved a mortar that dried hard but retained slight flexibility. It would accommodate minor ground movement without crumbling. The clay would swell slightly when wet, helping to seal rather than degrade. The wall construction began with the largest stones at the base. Axel placed each one carefully, testing its stability before adding mortar. He worked with the patience of a man building something permanent. Each stone was fitted to its neighbors, gaps minimized, weight distributed evenly. The walls rose slowly. Where an experienced mason might build several feet per day, Axel managed inches. But his walls were solid. There were no gaps large enough for wind to penetrate. The interlocking stones created a structure that gained strength as weight accumulated above. He built the walls directly against the earth berms on 3 sides. The north, east, and west walls were backed by tons of soil, creating insulation measured in feet rather than inches. Only the south wall, which contained the entrance, stood fully exposed. Even there, he designed a recessed entryway that would create a wind barrier. Neighbors who saw the walls emerging from the ground compared them to fortifications. The stones were fitted too carefully, the construction too deliberate. Einar asked if Axel was building a cabin or a castle. The boy was wasting time that should be spent trapping, preparing for next winter, doing productive work. Axel explained that this was preparation for winter. This was the most important work he could do. Einar shook his head and rode away. The community consensus was forming. The Berglund boy had talent and dedication, but he was applying both to a fundamentally flawed idea. By late June, the walls stood 3 feet high. The stone and mortar construction was proving more time-consuming than Axel had anticipated, but the result exceeded his expectations. The walls were thick, solid, and utterly unlike any cabin structure in the territory he kept building. The roof presented engineering challenges that kept Axel awake at night. A standard cabin roof supported only its own weight, perhaps 200 pounds of poles and bark. His roof would need to support 2 feet of earth across the entire span. He calculated the weight at roughly 4 tons. Building a structure that would not collapse under that load required timber selection and placement far beyond typical frontier construction. He spent a week in the forest identifying suitable trees. He needed lodge pole pines at least 10 inches in diameter with minimal taper and straight grain. Each tree was inspected for rot, insect damage, and structural defects before he marked it for cutting. He rejected trees growing in dense stands where they had grown tall but weak. He wanted trees from exposed areas where wind stress had created denser, stronger wood. Felling and transporting the timbers consumed 3 weeks. He cut 8 primary ridge beams, each 14 feet long and 10 inches thick. These would span the width of the cabin, resting on the stone walls and supporting everything above. He hauled them to the site using his father's horse and a drag system of ropes and levers. The ridge beams were installed on 12-inch centers, closer spacing than any cabin in the territory. Axel notched each beam to sit securely on the top course of stonework. He used wooden pegs driven through drilled holes to lock the beams to the walls. The result was a rigid framework that distributed weight across the entire wall structure rather than concentrating load at specific points. Across the ridge beams, he laid split planks. These were not random boards, but carefully hewn pieces, split from straight-grained pine. He used a froe and mallet to split logs along their grain, creating planks that were stronger than sawn lumber. Each plank was 8 feet long, 6 inches wide, and 2 inches thick. The planks overlapped like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. He laid them at a slight angle to encourage water drainage toward the front of the structure. Every plank was pegged to the ridge beams using whittled oak pins driven through pre-drilled holes. The pegs would swell when wet, creating connections that tightened rather than loosened over time. Over the planks he laid sheets of birch bark. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, used by natives for canoe construction. Axel harvested it in large sections, overlapping each piece and pegging it down. The bark created the first true waterproof layer. Einar visited during the roof construction and openly predicted failure. That much weight would crush the timbers within a year. The walls would bow outward. The entire structure would collapse, probably with Axel inside. It was basic physics, the old Norwegian claimed. You could not put that much earth on a roof without proper engineering. Axel pointed out that his father had been a mining engineer, and these were mining techniques adapted to cabin construction. Einar snorted. Mines had rock overhead, not timber. The comparison was meaningless. The boy would learn through failure. That was the only way stubborn youth ever learned anything. The waterproofing layer required preparation that began weeks before application. Axel collected pine resin by scoring bark on living trees and allowing the sticky sap to accumulate in containers. He gathered 20 pounds of the substance, a tedious process that involved checking his collection points every few days. He rendered the resin by heating it slowly over low fire, boiling off volatile compounds and reducing it to a thick, sticky tar. This required constant attention. Overheated resin would ignite. Underheated resin would not bond properly. The correct consistency was somewhere between honey and molasses when hot, becoming rock hard when cool. To the pine tar, he added rendered animal fat and powdered charcoal. The fat made the mixture more pliable. The charcoal increased durability and provided additional waterproofing. The result was a black compound that could be spread over the birch bark while warm and would cure into a flexible waterproof seal. He applied the mixture on a warm July day when the sun would help it cure. Working quickly before it cooled, he spread it across the entire birch bark surface using a flat wooden paddle. The layer was approximately half an inch thick, covering every seam and overlap. The smell was intense, pine and smoke, and rendered fat, creating an odor that clung to his skin for days. Over the tar layer, while it was still tacky, he pressed a layer of canvas. He had traded 2 prime beaver pelts for 20 yards of heavy duck canvas from a freight wagon passing through. The canvas embedded itself in the tar, creating a composite layer that combined the waterproofing of the tar with the structural strength of woven fabric. Another layer of tar went over the canvas, then another layer of birch bark. The result was a roof membrane 5 layers deep, each layer addressing a different potential failure point. Water that penetrated the outer bark would hit tar. Water that somehow bypassed the tar would hit canvas. The redundancy was excessive by frontier standards, but essential for Axel's purposes. The final weatherproofing step was the earth itself. He began moving the excavated soil back onto the roof. He started at the low edge and worked upward, spreading soil in 6-inch layers and compacting each before adding the next. The weight accumulated gradually, allowing the timber structure to settle and adjust. He watched carefully for signs of stress. The ridge beams showed slight deflection under load, but nothing approaching failure. The walls held firm. As the soil depth increased, the roof actually became more stable. The weight was distributed so evenly that no single timber bore excessive load. The final soil depth was 24 inches across most of the roof, slightly deeper at the back. Over this, Axel laid sections of sod he had cut from a meadow near the creek. The grass roots would stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. Within a season, the sod would root fully, creating a living roof indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Neighbors who saw the completed roof structure revised their predictions. It had not collapsed during construction, but surely it would fail during the first heavy snow. Winter loads would exceed what the timbers could support. Axel knew the math. Snow would add perhaps another ton. His structure was engineered for twice that load. He finished the roof in early August. The entrance required careful design to prevent wind from negating all his insulation efforts. A simple door opening would create a direct path for cold air to enter. Axel's solution was an angled entryway that turned 90 degrees between the exterior and interior. Wind could not blow directly into the living space. The design also created a small vestibule for storing tools and shedding snow-covered clothing. The door itself was constructed from 3-inch thick pine planks, fitted edge to edge, using tongue and groove joints. He had shaped each joint by hand, using a draw knife, creating connections so tight that light could not pass between planks. The assembled door was reinforced with diagonal bracing on the interior face and hung on iron hinges he had purchased in town. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the stone door frame, then pinned with iron rods. To remove the door, someone would need to destroy the stone surround. The door could be barred from inside using a heavy timber that slid into brackets mounted in the stone walls. The fireplace and chimney system represented the most technically challenging aspect of interior construction. Axel built the firebox from flat stones carefully selected for their heat resistance. He designed it smaller than typical cabin fireplaces, knowing that his structure would require far less heat. The firebox was only 18 inches wide and 20 inches deep. The chimney rose through the roof at an angle, allowing smoke to exit while minimizing the opening in his waterproof membrane. Where the chimney penetrated the roof, he created a sleeve of clay pipes surrounded by stones. This prevented the birch bark and tar from being exposed to high heat. The chimney extended 3 feet above the roof surface, enough to create proper draft. Inside the firebox, he built a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge halfway up the chimney throat. This feature, which he had seen in wealthy homes during a trip to St. Louis years earlier, served 2 purposes. It prevented downdrafts from blowing smoke into the room, and it reflected heat back into the living space, rather than allowing it all to escape up the chimney. The interior layout was simple but functional. He built a sleeping platform along the back wall, raised 2 feet off the floor. This provided storage space beneath and kept him off the cold ground. Though with his floor drainage system and earth insulation, the floor would never be truly cold. He constructed a work table and 2 storage shelves using the same careful joinery he had applied throughout the project. Every joint was fitted precisely, every surface was smooth. The furniture was built to last decades, not seasons. Ventilation was addressed through 2 small ducts built into the walls. Fresh air entered through a low duct near the door, warmed as it passed across the floor, and exited through a high duct near the chimney. The system created gentle air circulation without creating drafts. The ducts were sized to prevent animals from entering, but large enough to ensure adequate air exchange. By September, the structure was complete. 6 months of labor had produced something unprecedented in the territory. The completed structure was unlike anything in the Montana Territory. From a distance, it was nearly invisible. The sod roof had rooted and greened over, blending seamlessly with the hillside. Only the stone-framed entrance and the chimney revealed that something man-made existed. It looked like a natural feature of the landscape, which was exactly what Axel had intended. The community reaction was immediate and largely negative. When Einar brought 3 other trappers to see the finished work, they stood at the entrance and stared in disbelief. One of them, a burly Swede named Arna, asked if Axel planned to hibernate like a bear. Another suggested the boy had built himself a tomb and saved everyone the trouble of burying him later. Einar was more diplomatic but equally skeptical. He acknowledged the quality of the stonework and the obvious effort invested. But the fundamental concept remained wrong. Men were not meant to live underground. The structure was an insult to his father's memory, a rejection of everything proper cabin construction represented. Gunnar had been a good man who built a good cabin. The fact that he had died in it was tragedy, not design failure. Axel invited them inside. The interior was cool despite the September warmth outside. The stone walls radiated a steady, moderate temperature. Light entered through the door and reflected off whitewashed interior walls he had coated with a mixture of clay and lime. The space felt dry, comfortable, and unexpectedly pleasant. The trappers examined the fireplace, the sleeping platform, the storage shelves. They noted the careful craftsmanship, but remained unconvinced. Arna pointed out that Axel had not tested the structure through a real winter. The March storm that killed Gunnar had been unseasonably late and brief. A true winter would reveal the flaws in this design. Others in the scattered community were less restrained in their criticism. Bjorn spread word that the Berglund boy was living like a mole, like an animal too frightened to face the open sky. The description stuck. Within weeks, trappers throughout the region referred to Axel's home as the mole's burrow, or sometimes simply the hole. The mockery had an edge of genuine concern. Frontier culture valued independence and competence, but it also valued conformity to proven methods. Men who rejected traditional approaches were viewed with suspicion. They either proved themselves correct through success or proved themselves fools through failure. There was no middle ground. Axel heard the comments and ignored them. He spent late September stocking his shelter with supplies for winter. He needed far less firewood than a traditional cabin, perhaps 1/4 the usual amount. The space required less food storage because the constant cool temperature acted as natural refrigeration. His preparation work was lighter than it should have been, which only reinforced the community's belief that he was unprepared. October came cold and clear. Axel settled into his underground home and waited for winter to prove his design correct or expose his folly. The territory watched with the mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude that frontiersmen reserved for unconventional experiments. The winter of 1887 to 1888 began with unusual mildness. November brought cold nights but moderate days. Snow fell but melted within days. The trappers who had predicted Axel's design would fail in harsh conditions found themselves waiting for harsh conditions that refused to arrive. Inside his earth-sheltered home, Axel monitored the interior temperature carefully. He had fashioned a simple thermometer using a glass tube partially filled with colored alcohol, calibrated against the freezing point of water. The device was crude but functional. It revealed patterns that fascinated him. Exterior temperatures swung from the 20s at night to the 40s during sunny days. Interior temperature remained steady at 48 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. He did not light his fire for heat during November, only for cooking. The earth insulation worked exactly as his father's lessons had predicted. December brought colder weather, but still nothing extreme. Nighttime temperatures dropped into the single digits. Daytime highs struggled to reach 20. Other trappers began burning firewood steadily. Axel lit small fires in his efficient firebox and found that even a modest blaze raised his interior temperature to the mid-60s within an hour. The heat had nowhere to escape. He kept detailed notes, recording exterior conditions, interior temperature, firewood consumption, and observations about moisture, air quality, and comfort. The scientist in him, inherited from his father, demanded documentation. If this experiment worked, others should be able to replicate it using his data. Word filtered back through the trapping community. The boy's hole was apparently comfortable. He was burning almost no wood, but the real test had not come. Everyone knew that mild early winter often preceded brutal late winter. The storms that killed came in January and February, not November and December. Einar visited in late December, ostensibly to trade some coffee for ammunition. He spent an hour inside Axel's shelter, warming himself by the small fire and examining the construction details more carefully than he had before. He asked technical questions about the drainage, the roof structure, and the chimney draft. When he left, he told Axel the design was clever but untested. Clever meant nothing if it failed when conditions turned serious. The boy should not become overconfident based on a mild start to winter. Pride killed men in the mountains as surely as cold or bears. Axel thanked him for the concern and the coffee. He understood what Einar would not say directly. The older man hoped the design worked, but expected it to fail. That was the frontier way. Hope for the best, expect the worst, and never count on anything until it was proven beyond doubt. January arrived with continued moderate cold. The settlement's skepticism began shifting toward grudging curiosity. A few trappers asked questions about how the shelter was built. Axel shared information freely. He explained the drainage system, the layered roof, the thermal mass principles. Most listened politely but made no plans to attempt similar construction. Their cabins were adequate for normal winters. Why invest months of backbreaking labor for marginal improvement? The question was reasonable. Axel had no answer that would satisfy them. He had built what he built because his father died. Necessity drove innovation. Comfort did not. January passed into early February with cold but manageable conditions. Axel fell into the rhythms of winter solitude. He maintained his trap lines, processing beaver and marten pelts by the light of tallow candles. He read the few books he owned repeatedly. He carved wooden utensils and repaired equipment. He thought about his father constantly. The isolation would have driven some men to madness. Axel found it clarifying. The underground shelter created a sense of separation from the world that was both physical and psychological. When he closed the heavy door and barred it from inside, the wilderness ceased to exist. He occupied a pocket of controlled environment carved from chaos. Visitors were rare. A traveling priest stopped in late January, making his circuit of remote cabins. He spent a night in Axel's shelter and expressed amazement at the constant temperature and dry conditions. Most cabins he visited were damp, drafty, and barely warmer than the outside air. This structure was genuinely comfortable. The priest asked why more people did not build this way. Axel explained that most people followed tradition and feared innovation. The priest nodded. That described religious adherence as well as construction methods. Humans were creatures of habit, even when those habits worked against their own interests. Two trappers Axel barely knew stopped by in early February during a hunting trip. They had heard about the underground cabin and wanted to see it. They were younger men, perhaps in their middle 20s, less invested in traditional methods than the older generation. They asked detailed questions and took notes. One of them, a quiet Norwegian named Veko, said he planned to build something similar the following summer. He had nearly frozen the previous winter and recognized that standard cabin design was inadequate. If Axel's approach proved successful through a full winter, Veko wanted to replicate it. Axel encouraged him and offered to help with the design. Knowledge shared was knowledge preserved. If his father's engineering insights could help others survive, that seemed a worthy legacy. The quiet months revealed aspects of earth-sheltered living that Axel had not anticipated. The constant temperature meant food stored much better than in a standard cabin. Meat hung in the cool air remained fresh for weeks. Vegetables stored in bins did not freeze or rot. The environment was ideal for preservation. The silence was profound. Earth was an exceptional sound insulator. Wind that howled across the surface went unheard inside. Animals moving outside were invisible and inaudible unless they were directly at the entrance. The shelter created a cocoon of stillness that some would find disturbing, but Axel found peaceful. He developed rituals: morning fire for heat and coffee, afternoon work on pelts or equipment, evening reading by candlelight. The predictability was comforting. Time passed without drama, which on the frontier was a blessing. By mid-February, Axel had completed his most successful trapping season. His pelts were prime quality, and his fuel consumption was minimal. The design worked for normal winter conditions, but normal was about to end. The morning of January 12, 1888, began with unusual atmospheric pressure. Axel felt it in his ears, a sensation he recognized from his time in the mines, where pressure changes often preceded dangerous conditions. The sky had taken on a peculiar yellow-gray color. Birds were absent. The forest was silent in a way that felt ominous rather than peaceful. He checked his supplies. Firewood was stacked inside the entrance vestibule, enough for 2 weeks of normal use. Food stores were adequate. Water containers were full. His father had taught him that preparation prevented panic. He prepared without knowing specifically what was coming, only that something was. The temperature began dropping around noon, not gradually, but in a precipitous fall that seemed to defy normal weather patterns. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer outside read 15 degrees. By sunset, it had fallen to 0. By full dark, it was 20 below and still dropping. The wind arrived with the darkness. It came from the north, howling across the Montana landscape with force that bent trees and created drifts within minutes. Snow followed the wind, not falling so much as being driven horizontally. Visibility disappeared. The world became white chaos. Inside his shelter, Axel lit a small fire and settled onto his sleeping platform. He could hear the wind as a distant moan, muffled by tons of earth. The temperature inside his home was 47 degrees. The fire raised it slowly to 55. He was comfortable in a single wool shirt. He thought about the other trappers scattered across the territory. In their above-ground cabins, they would be fighting for survival. Fires would be roaring, consuming firewood at unsustainable rates. Wind would be forcing cold air through every gap in the chinking. Heat would be escaping through thin walls and inadequate roofs as fast as it could be generated. The storm intensified through the night. By morning, the temperature outside had reached 40 below 0. The wind had not diminished. These were conditions that killed even prepared men in well-built shelters. These were conditions similar to what had killed his father. Axel added wood to his fire, keeping it small and controlled. His interior temperature held steady at 58 degrees. He was using perhaps 1/10 the firewood a standard cabin would require. The earth around him, frozen solid on the surface, remained at stable temperature 6 feet down. His walls were backed by that stability. He ventured to the entrance and opened the door briefly. The wind tried to rip it from his hands. Snow had drifted against the stone facing, but the angled entryway had prevented it from blocking the door. He could exit if necessary, though going outside in these conditions would be fatal within minutes. He closed and barred the door, returning to the warmth of his fire. The storm could rage for days. Men would die, livestock would freeze, the territory would suffer. But in his underground shelter, surrounded by earth and stone and his father's engineering principles, Axel was safe. The impossible was proving possible. The mockery was about to become validation. The blizzard continued without pause for 3 days. The wind maintained its relentless assault. The temperature remained locked at 40 below or colder. Above ground, the Montana Territory was experiencing conditions that would be remembered for generations. Inside his earth-sheltered home, Axel maintained his routine as if nothing unusual was happening. He woke each morning and lit his fire. His small splits of pine no larger than his wrist were sufficient. Within an hour, his interior temperature reached the low 60s. He made coffee and ate a simple breakfast. The normalcy felt surreal given the catastrophe occurring beyond his walls. He spent the days reading, working on pelts, and maintaining his notes. Every few hours he checked the exterior thermometer through a small viewing port he had built into the door. The mercury remained stubbornly low, 42 below, 45 below. Once it touched 48 below, colder than anything recorded in the territory's brief written history. Standard cabins in these conditions became desperate places. The cold penetrated every defense. Men burned furniture when firewood ran out. They burned spare clothing. They burned anything that would produce heat. And still, the cold came through the walls, through the floor, through the roof. Ice formed on interior walls. Water froze solid despite being kept near fires. People huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped in every blanket and fur available. And still they shivered. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes despite being indoors. The very old and very young were at greatest risk. The margin between survival and death became measured in the ability to maintain core body temperature. Axel knew none of this detail yet, but he understood the physics. His father had explained heat transfer clearly. Warm air loses energy to cold surfaces. The greater the temperature difference, the faster the transfer. In a standard cabin with thin walls, the temperature difference between the 60-degree interior and the 40 below exterior created massive heat loss. The cabin could not generate heat faster than it escaped. His earth-sheltered design eliminated that differential. The earth surrounding his walls remained at 45 to 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions. His walls transferred heat into that moderate temperature, not into the extreme cold. The losses were minimal. A tiny fire replaced what little heat escaped, and the system maintained equilibrium. On the third day, he heard something unusual. A sound that penetrated even the earth's insulation. Someone was at his entrance, pounding on the door and shouting. He unbarred the door carefully, bracing against the wind that immediately tried to force it open. Einar collapsed through the opening, more dead than alive. His face was white with frostbite. His hands were frozen inside his mittens. He could barely speak. Behind him, 200 yards away, smoke still rose from his cabin chimney. But smoke meant nothing when the structure could not hold heat. Axel pulled him inside and barred the door. The older Norwegian was shaking violently, his body's desperate attempt to generate warmth. Axel removed the frozen mittens carefully, knowing that rough handling would damage tissue. He wrapped Einar in blankets near the fire and began the slow process of warming someone on the edge of death. Einar drifted in and out of consciousness for the first hour. Axel focused on stabilizing his core temperature without warming him too quickly, which could cause fatal shock. He placed warm stones wrapped in cloth near Einar's torso. He gave him small sips of warm broth. He monitored his breathing and pulse. The older man's fingers and nose were badly frostbitten, the tissue white and hard. Axel knew from his father's stories about mine accidents that the tissue was likely dead. Whether Einar would lose digits depended on how much damage had occurred. That assessment would come later. Right now, survival itself was uncertain. As Einar warmed, he began speaking in broken fragments. His cabin had been unbearable. The fire consumed wood faster than he could feed it. The walls were covered in ice. The cold came through the floor like rising water. He had burned everything burnable: his last chair, his spare blankets, the wooden bucket. When the firewood finally ran out, he had made a decision. He could stay and freeze to death, or he could attempt to reach Axel's underground shelter. The distance was only 200 yards, but in 40 below temperatures with wind, it might as well have been 2 miles. He had wrapped himself in everything he owned and run. He had nearly died anyway. Halfway across, he had fallen. The wind had disoriented him. He had crawled the final 100 yards, following the smoke from Axel's chimney. When he reached the door, he had no feeling in his hands. He had pounded with his forearms until Axel heard. By late afternoon, Einar's core temperature had stabilized. He was conscious and lucid, though weak. He looked around Axel's shelter with new eyes. The temperature inside was comfortable. The air was dry. The fire was small, almost laughably small compared to the inferno he had maintained in his own cabin. He asked how this was possible. Axel explained again the principles of earth insulation, thermal mass, and heat retention. But now Einar listened differently. Theory had become demonstrated fact. The boy he had dismissed as a grief-mad fool had built something that worked when everything else failed. That evening, 2 more people appeared at the door. A trapper named Veko and his younger brother, both nearly frozen. Their cabin had become uninhabitable. They had remembered Axel's shelter and stumbled through the storm to reach it. Axel brought them inside and began the warming process again. The shelter that had been built for 1 now housed 4. The space was crowded but functional. The temperature remained stable. The small fire Axel maintained was sufficient for everyone's needs. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 4 men survived in conditions that would be remembered as the worst in Montana's recorded history. Einar sat near the fire, flexing his damaged fingers slowly. He looked at Axel and said quietly that he had been wrong. The boy had not been a fool. He had been the only one smart enough to listen to what his father had tried to teach. The mole's burrow had become a sanctuary. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. The wind diminished to occasional gusts. The temperature began a slow climb from the depths. Sunlight appeared for the first time in nearly a week, weak but present. The 4 men inside Axel's shelter listened to the change in conditions with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because the immediate threat had passed. Dread because they knew what they would find when they ventured outside. The storm had killed. The only question was how many and who. Einar was the first to leave, insisting on checking his cabin despite Axel's warnings about his frost-bitten fingers. He returned an hour later, his face grim. His cabin was intact structurally but destroyed functionally. Everything burnable had been burned. The interior was coated in ice from condensed breath and body heat. It would take weeks to make the place habitable again. Veko and his brother returned to their cabin and found similar conditions. They had survived, but their shelter had been pushed beyond its limits. The damage was not to the logs themselves, but to everything inside. Food stores were frozen solid. Clothing was stiff with ice. The fire pit was full of ash from everything they had burned trying to stay warm. Over the next 3 days, as temperatures slowly moderated, the full scope of the disaster became clear. 3 trappers in the region had died. 2 had frozen in their cabins when firewood ran out. 1 had tried to reach a neighbor's cabin and died in the storm. An elderly couple who ran a small trading post had survived only because they had shared body heat with their livestock, bringing 2 goats inside their living space. The survivors began gathering to share information and assess damage. The gathering point, by unspoken consensus, became Axel's shelter. It was centrally located. It had survived the storm undamaged, and it represented something that needed to be discussed. 15 men crowded into the space designed for 1. They examined the stone walls, the earth roof, the efficient fireplace. They asked technical questions. How deep was the excavation? What prevented flooding? How was the roof supported? What kept the chimney from drafting poorly? Axel answered every question. He showed them his father's notes about thermal mass and earth temperature. He explained the layered waterproofing, the drainage system, the careful timber selection. He made it clear that this was not his innovation, but his father's knowledge applied to frontier conditions. Bjorn, who had mocked the design most openly, stood near the fire and spoke carefully. He said that he had been wrong. They had all been wrong. The boy had understood something they had missed. Traditional methods were adequate for normal conditions, but fatal in extreme conditions. The blizzard of '88 had proven that traditional was not good enough. Einar held up his bandaged hands, fingers blackened from frostbite. He said quietly that he would build an earth-sheltered cabin come spring. He was too old to ignore lessons purchased with flesh. Spring came late in 1888. The snow persisted through March, finally melting in April. As the ground thawed, construction began across the territory. 7 trappers started building earth-sheltered cabins based on Axel's design. Vaco began the most ambitious project, a structure even larger than Axel's, with refinements based on lessons learned during the storm. Axel helped anyone who asked. He explained drainage techniques to Bjorn. He showed Einar how to select and fit stones. He helped a young couple lay out their excavation with proper slope for water management. The knowledge his father had carried from the Minnesota mines was spreading, adapted, and refined with each new structure. The techniques varied based on available materials and individual skill. Some builders used more wood and less stone. Others created elaborate chimney systems or experimented with ventilation designs. But the core principles remained consistent. Build into the earth, not above it. Use thermal mass for insulation. Design for water drainage. Invest time during construction to save fuel forever. By fall, 12 earth-sheltered cabins existed in the region. The word spread beyond Montana. Trappers carried stories to Wyoming and Dakota territories. Settlers heading west heard about cabins that had survived 40 below temperatures with minimal firewood. The phrase, built earth style, entered the frontier vocabulary as shorthand for superior cold weather construction. Axel turned 18 that summer. He was no longer the grief-mad boy digging a hole. He was the young man who had solved a problem that killed experienced trappers. Men twice his age asked his advice. His opinion on construction matters carried weight that had nothing to do with his years. He never claimed credit for the innovation. When people called it the Berglund method, he corrected them. It was his father's knowledge. He had simply been desperate enough to apply it when everyone else followed tradition. Desperation and grief had driven him to build something different. The storm had proven it worked. Einar lost 2 fingers to frostbite but survived. He completed his earth-sheltered cabin in August and invited Axel to inspect it. The construction was solid, the design sound. The old Norwegian had learned well. He told Axel that the boy had honored his father better than any monument could. Gunnar had died teaching a lesson. Axel had ensured that lessons saved lives. The winter of 88 to 89 was mild, which some took as cruel irony. But those living in earth-sheltered cabins appreciated the design regardless of conditions. The structures were warmer in winter, cooler in summer, drier in rain, and more durable than traditional construction. What had begun as survival necessity had become preferred method. Axel lived in his underground shelter for 3 more years before eventually settling in Helena. He married, started a family, and worked as a consultant on building projects. But he never forgot the spring of 1887, watching his father die 6 feet from a roaring fire. Innovation born from tragedy, validated by necessity, and shared freely, had changed how people survived Montana winters. The impossible had become routine through nothing more than understanding that Earth was not just foundation, but ally.